Captain Ibrahim Traoré just did the unthinkable. He captured an American mining gang, accused of stealing billions in gold, and paraded them in front of the very treasure they tried to take. Can you imagine the look on their faces, kneeling under the glare of cameras, while the gold they smuggled out of Burkina Faso glittered behind them? Why would any leader risk diplomatic war, sanctions, and powerful enemies to make a point like this? And what does it take to turn a stolen tunnel into a national symbol of pride? Stay with me, because this is more than a story about gold. It's about dignity, betrayal, and the fight to reclaim Africa's wealth from foreign hands. But first, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if you believe Africa's time is now, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter. The gold tunnel, carved from the earth and polished by greed, now stood as a stage for truth. Every step Traoré took was deliberate, each echo bouncing off the walls like a drum beated of defiance. The executives avoided his gaze, their once confident postures broken under the weight of the nation's eyes. Outside, thousands gathered, pressed against barricades, their chants rumbling like distant thunder. Only hours earlier, the scene had been starkly different. Under the cover of darkness, elite units moved into position around the heavily guarded mining compound on the edge of Burkina Faso's Sahel region. Intelligence had confirmed that the Americans, operating under a web of shell companies, had been siphoning gold through illegal tunnels stretching for miles beneath the desert. Some of those tunnels, like the one Traoré now walked through, were lined with the very wealth they had stolen. Leila, the young investigative journalist who had risked her life to obtain the damning documents, was there too. Camera in hand, heart pounding like a warning drum. She knew this was her moment, the proof she had chased for years. "They told me it was dangerous to dig too deep," she murmured to herself. "But I had to." The raid had been swift and precise. Special forces, their faces masked, stormed the compound in synchronized waves, cutting off escape routes and disabling communications. Within minutes, the Americans were dragged from their luxury quarters, stripped of their phones, and marched toward the golden evidence of their crimes. Some cursed, some pleaded, but no one could stop what was coming. By dawn, the convoy was moving, a trail of armored vehicles heading toward the capital. Traoré had insisted on a route that passed through the very villages devastated by the mining operations. Along the way, mothers held up photos of children lost to poisoned water. Farmers lifted empty baskets. Elders raised their fists in silent solidarity. Could this passage be a form of truth-telling? One old woman, Salimata Doumbia, stood in the middle of the road until the convoy halted. Traoré stepped out, removed his beret, and bowed his head as she spoke. "Captain, they took our land, our water, our sons. Don't let them take our dignity." He met her eyes and simply said, "Never." The decision to hold the public reckoning inside the gold tunnel was both symbolic and strategic. This was not just about punishment, it was about reclaiming the story. The same tunnel where gold had been smuggled under cover of night was now illuminated not by greed, but by the unflinching light of accountability. Soldiers lined the walls, their weapons lowered but ready. Was this finally a turning point for Burkina Faso? International media cameras were positioned to broadcast every second. When Traoré entered the room, a silence fell so sharp it seemed to slice the air. He walked directly to the executives, his boots leaving wet prints on the polished floor. Stopping before the first man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure who once negotiated million-dollar deals, with a smirk, Traoré leaned forward just enough for the microphones to catch his voice. "You thought no one would see. You thought Africa would stay silent. Today you learn we are not silent. We are not blind." The man's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Traoré straightened, turned to the crowd beyond the barricade, and raised his voice. "This gold belongs to the people, and the people will decide your fate." The roar that followed shook the tunnel itself. Leila caught every frame, the way the light caught the gold, the way dust swirled in the air, the way Traoré's face held no triumph, only resolve. This was not a victory parade, this was a reckoning. The chants outside grew louder. "Justice! Justice!" And in that moment, it was clear this was not an isolated act. It was the spark of something bigger, a call that would echo far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. As the day wore on, more witnesses arrived. Miners with scarred hands, mothers with tear-streaked faces, elders carrying faded maps of lands now stripped bare. One by one, they stepped forward to tell their stories, and, with each testimony, the weight on the kneeling men's shoulders seemed to grow heavier. How many buried voices were finally being heard? Yet in the distance, there were whispers of resistance. In embassies and boardrooms far away, powerful figures were already plotting countermoves. The gold tunnel might be a symbol of justice today, but the battle for it, and for the soul of the nation, was only beginning. And as the last rays of sunlight pierced the tunnel entrance, Traoré knew the next steps would test not just his resolve, but the courage of an entire people. Could they stand when the spotlight moved away? The night was so still, it felt as if the desert itself was holding its breath. In the darkness beyond the city lights, the mining compound loomed like a shadowy fortress. High walls topped with razor wire, watchtowers spaced at precise intervals, floodlights sweeping across the yard every barmu seconds. Who had designed such a place? Justice or fear? Inside, American mining executives slept in air-conditioned rooms, unaware that their quiet empire was about to crumble. Captain Ibrahim Traoré crouched low in the sand dunes with his elite intelligence unit. They had been tracking the operation for months, piecing together reports from whistleblowers, satellite images, and smuggled documents. Tonight, it would all come together. His voice was barely above a whisper as he gave the final order. Move. Like a tide breaking against stone, the unit advanced. Silent feet pressed into the sand, avoiding the gravel paths that could betray them. The first team scaled the western wall, cutting the power to the outer security grid in seconds. The compound's lights flickered, then died, plunging the area into shadows broken only by the faint glow of a distant moon. At the southern entrance, another team disabled the cameras with precision shots, each lens cracking like a faint whisper in the dark. Inside the compound, guards were quick to notice something was wrong. A pair of armed men rounded a corner, flashlights cutting through the dark. They didn't get far. Two shadows dropped from above, weapons trained, forcing them to the ground. No shots fired, no alarms raised. Traoré moved through the compound like he had walked it 100 times before. His memory of the satellite maps was flawless. He led his team toward the administrative block, the heart of the operation. Would the evidence be waiting or already destroyed? This was where the contracts, forged shipping logs, and bank transfers would be stored. Breaking down the heavy wooden door took one swift strike from a breaching tool. The room inside smelled of paper and stale coffee. Filing cabinets lined the walls, but it was the steel safe in the corner that drew his attention. The safe was cracked open, not because someone had been careless, but because the Americans had grown arrogant. Inside, manila folders bulged with printed wire transfers, export licenses bearing forged signatures, and photographs of gold shipments hidden beneath crates of agricultural goods. One folder held maps of underground tunnels, hundreds of meters long, connecting the mine to secret exit points far from the compound, each one marked with dates and shipment weights. Billions in gold, stolen. Traoré's jaw tightened as he scanned the pages. "This is it," he said quietly. "The proof." Behind him, Leila Cohn's camera clicked, capturing every page, every damning detail. She wasn't supposed to be there. Journalists were rarely allowed in military operations, but Traoré had insisted. The people must see what was hidden from them, he had told her. The deeper they went, the more evidence they uncovered. Laptops still logged into encrypted accounts, invoices from European refineries, emails boasting that no African authority will dare touch us. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of the empire these men had built on lies and stolen earth. The operation wasn't without tension. As Traoré's men secured the records, a gunshot cracked the night from the far side of the compound. The sound shattered the quiet like glass. Traoré's radio came alive. "Contact Northgate." In an instant, the air surged with motion. He sprinted toward the sound, his team close behind. At the north gate, a handful of American-hired security contractors had formed a defensive line, their rifles raised. One of them barked into a radio, in a voice thick with panic, "Get them out now!" A black SUV roared to life, headlights slicing through the dark. Its tires spun violently in the sand, desperate to escape. "Drop your weapons!" Traoré's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and unyielding. The contractors froze. In that moment, a flashbang exploded near the SUV, the burst of sound and light forcing them to the ground. The vehicle's doors flew open and out stumbled two of the key executives, men whose names had appeared on every damning document in the safe. Their faces were pale, their expensive suits rumpled from sleep. One tried to speak, but Traoré's soldiers closed in, binding their wrists with swift precision. More executives were dragged from their rooms, some shouting, others too shaken to speak. The air thickened with dust, adrenaline, and the heavy realization that the power dynamic had shifted. Traoré stood before them, as steady as the cracked ground beneath their knees. "You have stolen from my people," he said, his voice rising above the clatter of soldiers securing the compound. "You have poisoned our rivers, emptied our land, and thought we would remain silent. But tonight, the silence ends." One executive tried to step forward, defiance dripping from his voice. "You can't touch us. We have protections." Traoré's eyes hardened. "Not here. Not anymore." His tone allowed no space for negotiation. He turned to his soldiers. "Take them alive. The people will judge." What would you choose in Traoré's place? Vengeance, diplomacy, or public trial? Share your view below, and if you trust his path, comment Amen. With that, the convoy began to form. Evidence was loaded into secure vehicles. The executives were placed under heavy guard. The compound that had once stood as a fortress of greed now lay in ruins, doors broken, files seized, its owners in chains. As the last soldier took position, Traoré gave the walls one final glance. This night would not be remembered for the raid alone, but for the message it sent far across the continent. The age of taking without consequence was over. And as the engines roared to life, the desert wind carried the sound to the horizon, as though whispering to distant ears that justice was finally on the move. Leila Cohn sat alone in the dim glow of her apartment, papers spread across her small wooden table like a battlefield map. The city outside lay still, save for the hum of the occasional motorcycle. Her hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the weight of what she held. Dozens of contracts, each bearing the signatures of American mining executives and high-ranking officials in Burkina Faso. Some printed on official government letterhead, others stamped with corporate seals. But all had one thing in common: corruption woven into every clause. She had retrieved them only hours earlier, slipping them into her bag as Traoré's soldiers locked down the compound. Now, under the flickering desk lamp, she read them one by one. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. Preferential extraction rights in exchange for expedited permits, adjustments to environmental compliance fees, and most damning of all, direct bank transfers from offshore accounts to personal accounts of local officials. The amounts were staggering, enough to build hospitals, schools, and clean water systems for hundreds of thousands. It begged the question: how many lives had been traded for private gain? Instead, the money had vanished into private pockets while entire villages starved and sickened. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to keep reading. Every page she turned seemed to whisper the same message: greed dressed as partnership, theft disguised as trade. The Americans had been meticulous, hiding behind webs of shell companies and layers of legal jargon. But the paper trail was too long, too consistent to be accidental. Somewhere between the 10th and 11th document, her phone buzzed. It was a secure line. "Leila, it's Idris Faye," the voice said. He was her editor at Radio UA Libre, the last independent station still willing to air stories the government preferred to silence. "Do you have enough?" She looked at the mountain of evidence spread before her. "Enough to bury them," she replied. Idris's voice stayed calm, but she heard the tight edge beneath it. "Then you know what comes next. Midnight broadcast. We'll patch you in live. But Leila, once you do this, there's no turning back." She closed her eyes briefly, letting his words settle into her bones. She had been a journalist long enough to know what this meant. The threats, the blacklists, the cold possibility of vanishing without a trace. But she had also known for years that silence was its own form of complicity. And long ago, she had sworn never to be complicit. "I'll be ready," she said. By the time the clock struck midnight, the studio glowed only with the red hum of the on-air sign. Idris sat behind the control board, his eyes steady on her as she adjusted the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was calm and measured, but every word burned from the fire in her chest. "Good evening, Burkina Faso," she began. "Tonight, I will not tell you a story. I will show you the truth." She shuffled the papers deliberately, letting the microphone pick up the sound. Proof to the listeners that what she held was real. For years, we've been told that foreign mining partnerships are our path to prosperity, that the gold taken from our land would return to us in schools, clinics, and roads. She paused here, letting the silence stretch. "But these documents," she continued, "tell another story. A story of bribes, of stolen wealth, and betrayal by those who swore to serve us." She began reading excerpts aloud, naming names. A minister who approved illegal mining permits in exchange for a mansion in France, a corporate lawyer who funneled millions through fabricated charities, an American executive who wrote in an internal email, "No African court will touch us." Each revelation struck like a hammer. The phone lines lit up within minutes. First came the shaken voices, trembling but clear. A teacher from Bobo Dioulasso who hadn't been paid in 6 months. A farmer whose land had been swallowed whole by the mine. A widow whose husband died in a tunnel collapse, never acknowledged by the company. Then came the fury. Callers demanding resignations, trials, restitution. One man shouts into the airwaves, "We bleed so they can feast no more." Across the nation, families huddled around radios. The glow of the hour replaced by something electric. A sense that something had shifted. Oh, I could feel it. A deep, slow awakening rising from the belly of the country. She read one final clause from a contract, her voice sharp and unwavering. "In the event of government inquiry, all disputes shall be settled privately." She looked up. "My fellow citizens, they believed they could keep this private forever. But tonight, it is public. Tonight, the gold they thought was theirs is ours again. In truth, if not yet in law." Idris signaled for her to wrap up. The clock ticked past Mot Gio Sang. She leaned in one last time. "Ibrahim Traoré has captured the men who signed these deals. Soon, they will stand before you, and you will decide their fate. But know this. Justice does not end with the guilty kneeling in shame. Justice begins when the people rise to claim what is theirs." The line went dead, and for a long moment the studio was silent, except for the hum of equipment. Idris let out a long breath. "You just changed the game," he said quietly. Outside the station, the streets remained cloaked in darkness, but somewhere in the distance, she could hear it. Faint at first, then rising. Voices. Chants. A crowd moving through the night, carrying the echo of her broadcast like a torch passed from hand to hand. Leila Cohn stepped out into the cool air, clutching her bag of documents like a weapon forged from truth. She knew the days ahead would be perilous. Powerful men would try to discredit her, threaten her, perhaps worse. But she also understood something essential had shifted. The people had heard the truth. And once the truth takes root, it spreads. Wild, untamable. The convoy slowed as it veered off the main road onto a narrow dirt path. The tires kicked up thick clouds of pale dust. Traoré stood in the back of the lead vehicle, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert. The land before them was barren. Where once there had been green, now there was only grey. The air was thick with a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. They arrived at what had once been a thriving village. Now only the cracked shells of mud brick houses remained, their roofs collapsed under years of decay. At the center of the square stood a sealed well covered in rusted metal sheets. The water beneath had long been declared unsafe. A small group of survivors waited beneath the skeletal branches of a tree that offered more memory than shade. They rose slowly as the vehicle stopped, their faces carved with years of hardship. Among them stood Salamata Doumbia, her back bent with age, but her eyes fierce with memory. She stepped forward leaning on a wooden staff. Her white headscarf danced lightly in the dry wind as she looked directly at Traoré. "You came," she said simply. He removed his beret and bowed his head. "I had to see this with my own eyes." She nodded, then motioned gently for him to follow. Together they walked past the ghostly remains of homes, past fields where nothing now grew. The soil was strange, an unnatural, sickly grey, cracked like old pottery. "It started when they came with their machines," Salamata began, her voice steady but low. "They promised us jobs, roads, a clinic. They gave us helmets, told our boys to dig. We did not know they would take more than the gold." She stopped beside the well, tapping the rusted lid with her staff. "One morning the water smelled different. We thought maybe it was the rains, but within weeks the children began to fall ill. Their skin broke out in sores, their bellies swelled. We took them to the clinic they built, but the clinic had no medicine." Her eyes clouded, and her grip on the staff tightened. "My grandson, Karim Doumbia, was only 8, a strong boy. He used to run to the hills and back without stopping. One evening he drank from this well. That night, he started coughing. By morning, he was gone." The silence that followed was deep. Even the soldiers nearby stood motionless, their expressions unreadable but somber. Traoré felt the weight of her words settle across his shoulders like iron. He had read the reports, seen the photographs, heard the statistics. But here, standing in the very place where a child had lived, played, and died, the truth had a sharper edge. Salamata continued walking. She led him to the edge of the village where a narrow stream had once flowed. Now the water was thick, yellow, its surface broken by clusters of foam collecting along the banks. "This is what they left us," she said, pointing with her staff. "We could no longer farm. The goats died first. Then people began to leave. Those who stayed, most are buried now." She turned to face him fully. "Captain, they didn't just steal our gold. They killed our home. They killed our children. You must make them answer for that." Traoré's jaw tightened. "They will," he said, his voice low. "I promise you they will." He gestured to his men, who began photographing the well, the stream, and the abandoned homes. Samples of the soil and water were carefully taken, sealed for testing. Evidence for a trial, not in words, but in facts the world could no longer ignore. Leila Cohn, who had accompanied the convoy, was quietly recording Salamata Doumbia's testimony. Her camera lingered on the woman's weathered face, on the cracked earth beneath her feet. This footage would speak louder than any statistic, louder than any official report crafted in distant boardrooms. As they moved back toward the village square, Salamata paused beside a row of unmarked graves. "We could not afford headstones," she explained, "so we planted flowers. But nothing grows here now. Even the flowers die." She looked directly at Traoré, her gaze unwavering. "If you take them to the people's court, tell them about Karim. Tell them about all of them." He placed a hand over his heart. "Their names will not be forgotten." Around them, villagers began to gather, drawn by the sight of the soldiers and the captain among them. Some carried faded photographs of the lost. Others brought jars filled with the discolored water, holding them up like sacred offerings, proof of their pain. The air was heavy with grief, but it carried something else too. A rising defiance, slow but certain. Traoré raised his voice so all could hear. "I came here to see the truth. Now I have seen it. And I swear to you, those responsible will answer. For every life lost, every drop of poisoned water, every home destroyed. They will kneel not only before the gold they stole, but before the people they wronged." A murmur passed through the crowd, gathering strength until it became a chant. Justice, justice. It wasn't loud, but it carried like a drumbeat, pulsing with something that could not be silenced. As the convoy prepared to leave, Salamata stepped close to him again. "Captain," she said softly, When you stand before them, remember this place. Remember Kareem. And remember that some wounds cannot be healed with money. He met her gaze. I will remember. As they drove away, the village faded into the distance, a hollow shell of what it once had been. But the image of Salimata Doumbia, standing beside the sealed well, her staff planted firmly in the earth, remained with him. That moment burned into his memory. The fight was no longer just about stolen gold. It was about stolen lives. And that made the battle ahead even more urgent, even more personal. The gold tunnel was colder than anyone had expected. Its rough walls shimmered under the harsh glare of portable floodlamps, every fleck of gold catching the glow like embers buried in darkness. Soldiers lined the entrance, rifles slung but ready, forming a silent, immovable barrier between the outside world and the reckoning taking place within. The American executives knelt in the center, their hands bound. Their expensive suits were crumpled, streaked with dust. Cameras from national television crews captured every angle, their lenses reflecting the golden walls like mirrors to a crime scene. But this was no courtroom, no judges in robes, no wooden benches. This was the people's hearing. And the people were already filing in. Villagers came first, their steps slow and deliberate as they entered the tunnel. Some clutched photographs of the dead. Others carried jars of poisoned water or fragments of shattered tools from the mines. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the tunnel's golden walls, making the space feel like it was holding its breath, waiting. Traoré stood at the far end, his posture straight, his beret casting a shadow across his eyes. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone commanded the chamber. The first witness to step forward was Salimata Doumbia. She walked without hesitation, her wooden staff tapping softly against the polished stone floor. She stopped just a few feet from the nearest executive, her eyes locking onto him without a flicker of fear. When she spoke, her voice carried through the tunnel and echoed like an accusation from the earth itself. "You took my grandson's life," she said, her tone steady but each word heavy with grief. "You poisoned our water, destroyed our land, and left us to bury our children in soil that will never grow again. And you thought no one would come for you." The executive avoided her eyes, staring at the floor. But Salimata's voice did not waver. "I am here to tell you, we came." She stepped back, and the next witness approached. A man in his 40s, with the hardened hands of a miner. His name was Amadou Sissoko, and he carried a dented metal helmet. "This belonged to my brother," he said, holding it high so the cameras could see. "He died in your tunnels. The walls caved in because you refused to fix the supports. We dug him out with our bare hands." His voice caught for a moment, then hardened. "You didn't even stop the machines." He turned his eyes on the executives. "You see gold. We see graves." More witnesses followed. A young mother whose baby had been born sick after she drank from the contaminated river. A schoolteacher who lost half his students to hunger and illness after their parents' jobs disappeared. A nurse who had watched people die without medicine or hope. Each story was a blow, not just to the men kneeling on the floor, but to anyone who had ever thought the theft of gold was only about money. This wasn't economics. This was blood gold, wealth forged in the suffering of others. Leila Cohn moved through the crowd, quiet but focused. Her camera captured every word, every tear, every clenched jaw. The tunnel's golden walls gave back every sound, turning the testimonies into a haunting chorus. The echoes wrapped around the executives until there was nowhere left to hide. When the final witness finished speaking, the silence became almost unbearable. Traoré stepped forward at last, his boots clicking against the floor. He stopped directly before the kneeling men. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his voice cut through the air with the sharpness of judgment. "You built your wealth on the bones of my people. You believed distance and power would protect you. You believed our silence was weakness." He gestured behind him, to the villagers, to the glowing walls of the tunnel. "Look around you now. This is where your arrogance brought you, kneeling in the very place you used to rob us." One executive raised his head slightly, his voice faint but defiant. "We were only following contracts." Traoré's expression didn't change. Contracts signed with bribes, laws bent with lies, words written in the blood of our children. His eyes swept the room. Here, there is no lawyer to twist the truth, no judge to be bought, only the people you stole from, and the gold you thought was yours. The villagers murmured, the sound growing. Some shouted for prison, others called for the gold to be melted down and returned. The energy in the tunnel swelled like a storm. Traoré raised his hand, the noise quieted instantly. Justice will be decided here, he said, not in a foreign court, not in secret meetings. Here, before the eyes of the nation. He turned to Salamata Doumbia. What is your judgment? She stepped forward again, her eyes fixed on the men who had brought such ruin. They should live to see what they destroyed rebuilt. Without them. Let them work the land they poisoned until their hands are as rough as ours. Let them see every brick laid with the gold they stole. Amadou Sissoko spoke next. No comfort, no escape. They must rebuild the schools they closed, dig the wells they poisoned, and they will never leave this soil again. The crowd murmured in agreement, the sound rising like a tide of shared justice. Traoré looked once more at the kneeling men. You hear them, he said quietly, and you will obey, because here you are no longer executives, you are prisoners of the people. He stepped back and the soldiers moved in. Chains rattled as they were fastened. Shackles clinked against the floor. As they were led away toward a guarded transport, the villagers remained in the tunnel, standing among the gleam of gold that was finally, undeniably theirs again. The hearing was over, but its echoes lingered in the gold walls. Whispers that would outlast the men now in chains. Justice had been named, and it had a voice. In Washington, mourning broke with the kind of urgency that unsettles even the most seasoned diplomats. The usual hum of the State Department was replaced by brisk footsteps and the constant chime of secure phones. The gold tunnel footage had aired worldwide overnight. American executives kneeling beneath floodlights in a blaze of gold, while Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood over them like a verdict made flesh. By dawn, every major news network was looping the images. Analysts debated furiously. Was this a diplomatic crisis or a scandal of global proportions? What was undeniable was that the world had seen it, and no one could unsee it now. Inside the US Embassy in Ouagadougou, the ambassador's conference room was packed with pale, tense faces. A hastily convened video call linked them to the State Department's Africa Bureau. "We need a statement within the hour," a voice from Washington demanded. "Deny involvement. Stress that these are private business disputes, not official US policy." The ambassador rubbed his temples, visibly exhausted. "That's not going to work. The documents Leila broadcast have signatures, bank transfers, even references to our own embassy staff. If we deny too hard, it'll scream cover-up." Another voice, colder, from the Office of Economic Affairs, cut in. Then pivot. Say, "We had no knowledge of illegal activity and are deeply concerned. Promise cooperation, but only in terms that protect national interests." In the corner, a junior political officer sat quietly, scrolling through a secured cable feed. His screen filled with classified messages dated from the previous year. The subject lines read like confessions, mining operations, sensitive partnerships, local water contamination, advise discretion, contract renewal, ensure smooth passage. Each cable documented a pattern. Embassy staff reporting environmental destruction, labor violations, bribery, yet recommending against public action for fear of jeopardizing strategic investment flows. Then he froze. One cable, dated months earlier, detailed a private dinner between embassy officials, 2 American executives now under arrest, and a senior Burkina Faso minister. The notes were brutally clear. Minister expresses concern over growing unrest. Embassy reassures. US will ensure media narratives remain favorable. He looked up, face pale. "Sir, they knew, not just knew, they facilitated." The room went silent. The ambassador's jaw tensed. "Keep that screen closed," he ordered sharply. "If that gets out, we're past damage control. This won't just be a PR crisis." But it was already too late. Someone else in the room had silently tapped out a message to a contact in the press. One signal, one forward, one leak. In Washington, the Africa bureau chief was briefing a senior group of White House advisors. The optics are catastrophic. Traoré has turned this into a public morality play. And we're cast as the villains. We need to get ahead of this before Congress starts demanding hearings. A national security advisor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You're missing the real threat. This isn't just about gold, it's about influence. Traoré is positioning himself as the face of African sovereignty, and he's doing it by putting American business on trial. If he pulls this off, he continued, other countries will follow his lead. The room fell into an uneasy quiet. Everyone understood what that would mean. If even one leader could seize American assets, parade executives through the courts of public opinion, and survive the backlash, it would tear apart decades of carefully constructed leverage over African resource agreements. Back in Ouagadougou, the embassy released its first official statement. The United States is aware of the situation involving certain American citizens in Burkina Faso. We respect the sovereignty of the Burkina government and trust that due process will be observed. The words were sterile, almost neutral. But inside the embassy walls, quiet panic was beginning to smolder. Staff were ordered to scrub any mention of mining companies from all public-facing materials, websites, and press briefings. Security was heightened. Unmarked cars began moving between the embassy and residences in the wealthier districts, ferrying individuals who no longer wished their names associated with the scandal brewing just beneath the surface. They moved quickly, silently, shadows of a crumbling narrative. Meanwhile, in Leila Cohn's newsroom, the tide was shifting fast. An anonymous encrypted file arrived, containing dozens of pages of embassy communications. Her editor clicked through the documents, his eyes widening. They can't talk their way out of this, he murmured. This is complicity. In writing. By evening, the story had burst beyond Africa's borders. In New York, a primetime anchor leaned into the camera and asked, did US officials look the other way while American companies poisoned an African village for profit? In Paris, political panels argued fiercely over whether the scandal would accelerate the decline of Western influence in the Sahel. In Washington, the White House press secretary stood beneath the glare of reporters' flashbulbs. The questions came fast and sharp. Were US diplomats aware of bribery? Did the State Department protect these companies? Will the administration cooperate with Traoré's investigation? She stuck to her talking points. We are monitoring the situation closely and remain committed to our partnership with the people of Burkina Faso. But the cracks were showing. Behind closed doors, congressional aides prepared subpoenas. Lobbyists for the mining firms scrambled to schedule closed-door meetings with lawmakers and defense committees. The tone had shifted, from defense to survival. Back in Ouagadougou, the US ambassador received a final directive just before midnight. It said only, whatever it takes, no more surprises. He read it twice, then looked out the window toward the faint glow of the distant city. Somewhere beneath that halo of light was the gold tunnel, the kneeling executives, and the man who had dragged decades of empire's secrets into the open for the world to judge. For the first time in his career, the ambassador quietly admitted to himself that containment might already be impossible. Far from the capital, the march began as a murmur. In the mining towns, former laborers, men who had once swung pickaxes deep in the shafts, began to gather. Women who had scrubbed gold dust from their fingers until their skin split now walked beside them. They had lived in fear for years, watched, warned, silenced, told that speaking out meant losing everything. But the footage from the gold tunnel had changed the rules. Now they were in the streets, no longer afraid. From Bobo Dioulasso to Ouagadougou, they surged forward in waves, carrying homemade signs, battered helmets held high like trophies from a different kind of war. Their chant was simple, pounding in rhythm with their footsteps. Gold for the people, not for thieves. The sound grew louder with every block they passed, a steady thunder rolling through the streets of the capital. Some marched barefoot, others in dusty work boots, but all walked with one purpose that bound them like steel. Old men with stooped backs marched beside teenagers who had never once set foot in a mine. but who understood exactly what had been taken from them. Women came too, widows, mothers, sisters, each face carved with the weight of personal loss and the iron will to see justice done at last. Leila moved through the crowd with her camera, capturing faces as they turned toward her lens, eyes burning with clarity and resolve. She caught a man holding up a faded pay-up, its ink nearly erased by time and sweat. 3 months' wages, he said into her microphone, for a year of work. They told us the rest was for taxes. Now we know where it went. Another marcher, his hands visibly scarred from decades underground, raised his voice, cutting through the noise. We dug that gold. They built nothing for us. Not even a clean well. The bitterness in his tone struck the camera as much as the crowd around him. Word of the march reached Traoré well before the first column arrived in the capital. He could have watched from a distance, high behind barricades. But instead, he chose to meet them face to face. When the crowd rounded the final turn and saw him waiting at the head of the boulevard, flanked by soldiers, no podium, no amplification, the chant wavered for just a heartbeat. He stepped forward. There was no barrier between him and the people. The crowd parted to let a small group of former miners approach. The man in front, tall, lean, eyes dark with fatigue, spoke clearly. "Captain, we've been silent too long. We want the gold returned to the people. Not hidden in foreign vaults or shipped away behind contracts we never saw. We want the land repaired, the rivers cleaned, the schools rebuilt for our children." His voice shook, not from fear but from the fragile edge of new hope. Traoré looked around at the sea of faces. He saw exhaustion etched in brows, scars of labor across hands, and a quiet dignity that demanded no applause, only action. "I have seen what was taken from you," he began, his voice carrying without a microphone. "I have walked through villages where children died from poisoned water. I have held the contracts that sold our land for bribes, and I have stood in the gold tunnel while those who did this knelt before the nation." A ripple moved through the crowd, a tide of grief and pride. He continued, "I promise you this. Every ounce of gold stolen will be accounted for. Every coin will be turned into something that serves the people: schools, hospitals, clean water, jobs. We will not sell it back to the same hands that took it. We will rebuild with it." An old miner stepped forward, his helmet dented and rusted from years of labor underground. He held it out to Traoré. "This is all I kept from those years," he said. "Take it, melt it down with the rest. Let it build something better than what we were left with." Traoré accepted it with both hands, nodding once. "It will," he said solemnly. Around them, the chant began again, louder and deeper than before. "Gold for the people, not for thieves." It rolled down the wide boulevard, echoing off government buildings, spilling into every narrow side street. The soldiers at Traoré's side straightened their postures, not as guards, but as solemn witnesses to something larger than law or retribution. This wasn't just a protest. It was a reclamation. As the march surged toward the center of the capital, people streamed out of shops, balconies, and doorways to join. Some offered bottles of water. Others waved flags stitched from faded cloth once used for uniforms. A group of schoolchildren, led by their teacher, walked quietly at the edge of the crowd. Each child held up a small card painted gold, their eyes wide with pride. Leila stayed close to Traoré, her camera recording every handshake, every clasped shoulder, every glance exchanged in solemn recognition. She captured the raw intimacy of this moment, where people and leader moved not in speeches, but in step. She knew these images would be as powerful as the gold tunnel footage. They would reveal not just the crime, but the unity it had sparked. By the time the march reached Independence Square, the crowd had swelled to fill every corner. Traoré ascended the steps of the old government building and turned to face them. "You have marched for justice," he said, "and justice will answer you." He paused, letting the silence hang. "But know this. This fight is not over when the guilty are sentenced. It ends only when no one can take from you again. When your work builds your own future. When your gold is your children's inheritance, not a stranger's fortune." The square erupted in applause, then chants, the sound echoing across rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. A few moments later, they were joined by the call to prayer from a nearby mosque. The two sounds wove together above the crowd, like a blessing rising with the heat of the day. In that moment, under the weight of the sun, the miners' revolt became something more than protest. It became a promise, a signal that the nation was finally ready to rise. The holding room was deep inside a secure military compound. Its thick concrete walls were built to keep sound in and prying eyes out. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak yellow halo over the steel table in the center. On one side sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, back straight, hands calmly resting in front of him. On the other sat Douglas Hale, one of the most senior executives captured during the Gold Tunnel raid. Gone was the smooth-talking figure who once dazzled investors in boardrooms. His tailored suit was wrinkled. His tie had vanished. A sheen of sweat clung to his forehead despite the room's cool air. For a long time, neither man spoke. Traoré's gaze was steady, unblinking. Hale shifted in his chair. His cuffed wrists clinked softly against the steel. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Captain, I think we can help each other." The words hovered in the air, carefully measured, clearly rehearsed. Traoré didn't respond. "Help," Hale repeated. He nodded slightly and leaned forward. "You've made your point. The cameras, the public spectacle, it's all very effective. But you and I both know that holding us here will create problems for you. Diplomatic problems, economic ones, problems that can disappear if we make a deal." His voice softened, the salesman in him re-emerging. "I have access to accounts, private ones, more than bond-tie dollars offshore, completely untraceable. You release us quietly, no more public humiliation. And those funds? Well, they could be transferred anywhere you like. Infrastructure, military upgrades, even for personal use. No one would ever know." Douglas Hale sat back as if expecting the weight of the offer to shift the very balance in the room. Traoré remained silent for a few seconds longer, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, his voice low but razor-sharp. "Bontai, is that what you think a river is worth? How much for the lungs of a child who breathed in your dust? How much for the stomach swollen from poisoned water?" Hale's composure faltered. "This is more than charity," he said. "It's a chance to rebuild. Rebuild what you destroyed." Traoré cut in, his tone still calm, but carrying a dangerous edge. "You speak of money as if it can erase the graves in Mariam's village. You think I can hand it to the mothers who buried their children and say, 'Here now you can forget'?" Douglas Hale shifted again, his hands tightening into fists. "Captain, you're not thinking strategically. This is a way to win without a fight." "No, Traoré," said Traoré, his voice cold as stone. "This is your way to escape the fight you've already lost." He stood slowly, the chair legs scraping against the floor. "You can't buy back the rivers you poisoned. You can't bribe the land to grow again. And you cannot purchase the dignity you tried to take from my people." Hale swallowed hard, his confidence beginning to unravel. "Then what happens to us?" Traoré leaned over the table until his face was just inches from Hale's. "You face the people. You hear every story, you see every face, and when they decide your fate, you will live with it or die with it." The door opened, and two soldiers stepped in. Without another word, Traoré straightened and walked out, leaving Hale in the harsh yellow pool of light, alone and stripped of any leverage. Outside the room, Leila was waiting. Her camera lowered, but still powered on. "He tried to buy you off," she said. "It wasn't a question." "They always do," Traoré replied. "They believe the world runs on their terms, that everything, land, water, life, has a price." He glanced toward the steel door behind him. "They're about to learn there are things no gold, no money, no account can ever touch." As they walked down the corridor, the murmur of voices from outside the compound grew louder and more intense. The miners were still gathered beyond the gates, chanting with fervor, their helmets held high like banners of defiance. Word had spread. Douglas Hale had tried to cut a secret deal. And the crowd's anger burned hotter with every rumor. When Trio stepped out into the sunlight, the chant shifted instantly. No deals, no deals. The sound rolled like a thunderclap across the square. He raised a hand and the crowd quieted enough to hear him speak. They think they can buy their way out, he said, his voice firm and clear. They think our rivers, our fields, our children are for sale. But we are not for sale. Not now, not ever. The square erupted again. The chant became a roar. Hale could hear it from inside his holding cell, the sound pressing against the walls like a living force. For the first time since his arrest, he understood the truth. This fight was never just between him and one man. It was between him and an entire nation that had decided it could not be bought again. The first video clip appeared online just after dawn, uploaded anonymously to multiple platforms at once. Grainy at first, then sharpening, it showed a boardroom in Zurich, sleek, sterile, and unmistakably European. Around the table sat executives from one of the continent's largest private banks. Their conversation, caught by a hidden microphone, was chilling in its casualness. The shipments arrive under agricultural manifests, one man said, tapping a folder. We process the transfers through our Luxembourg branch, then route them to holding accounts in the Caymans. Another voice chimed in, smooth and confident. And the Burkina side? Any risk of exposure? A third voice laughed softly. None. Their own officials signed off. The Americans handled the extraction. We just make the gold disappear on paper. The footage jumped to another location. An upscale cafe in Brussels. A woman in a tailored suit leaned across the table to speak to a colleague. The profit margins are absurd. It's cleaner than diamonds, and the public barely notices gold. As long as Trio keeps busy with politics, our lines stay open. She sipped her coffee as if discussing weather, not the laundering of a nation's wealth. Within hours, the video had gone viral. News anchors across Europe struggled to contain their shock as they confirmed the identities of those in the footage. These weren't fringe operators. They were senior executives from institutions trusted to safeguard the world's wealth. And they had been moving stolen gold through legitimate financial channels with impunity. In Ouagadougou, the footage landed like a spark on dry grass. The gold tunnel, already a national symbol after the public hearings, took on an even sharper meaning. It wasn't just about the Americans. It wasn't just about one company. It was a window into a global network that had treated Burkina Faso as a private vault to be emptied at will. Do you believe Traor's stand marks the beginning of a new era for Africa, or is the cost of defiance too high? Share your thoughts and comment One Africa if you believe in hope. Leila replayed the video in her newsroom, her pen tapping against the desk. They weren't just helping, she said to her editor, they were the spine of the operation. Without these banks, the gold couldn't move, the bribes couldn't be paid. This was bigger than anyone thought. International markets reacted instantly. Gold prices swung wildly as investors scrambled to calculate the fallout. European bank stocks plunged. And politicians who had long dismissed Traor's accusations now found themselves cornered by journalists waving transcripts of the leaked conversations. In London, the finance minister was pressed outside Parliament. "Will you investigate the banks named in this scandal?" a reporter shouted. He offered a tight, non-committal smile. "We take these allegations seriously." In Paris, a prominent banker resigned within hours of the footage airing, his statement dripping with denials, even as investigators raided his offices. In the gold tunnel itself, Traoré stood with a small group of advisors, reviewing the growing pile of evidence. The walls seemed to glow brighter than usual under the floodlights, as if the metal itself was aware of its role in the unfolding drama. "This tunnel is more than proof of theft now," one advisor said quietly. "It's proof of the system that allowed it. And that system is cracking." Traoré nodded. The world thought they could hide behind distance, that if they moved the gold far enough, washed it through enough hands, no one would see the trail. Now the trail is lit for all to see. He stepped closer to the bound executives who had been brought in for another round of questioning. "You told yourselves you were just businessmen," he said. "But businessmen don't poison rivers. They don't bury children's futures under contracts and call it development." One of the men shifted uncomfortably. "You can't fight all of them, Captain. The banks, the governments, there are too many." Traoré's reply was immediate. You start by fighting one, then the next. And when the world sees you will not stop, others join you. Outside the tunnel, the streets of Agadir filled again, now with signs and chants that had evolved. Not just the miners, but mothers, teachers, everyday citizens marched shoulder to shoulder. One banner read, "Prosecute the bankers." Another depicted a map of Europe, with gold bars dripping crimson as if bleeding. Crowds gathered around large outdoor screens, replaying the leaked footage, faces alight with both anger and grim satisfaction. Internationally, alliances began to shift. In parts of West Africa, leaders who had stayed silent during the American arrests now saw a political opportunity. Publicly condemning the European banks earned them quick support at home. Privately, some reached out to Traoré, offering intelligence on other smuggling networks in exchange for future cooperation. But within the financial centers of Europe, the reaction was starkly different. Behind closed doors, bank directors met with government officials pushing for damage control. "We can't afford to let Burkina Faso dictate the narrative," one banker warned during a meeting in Frankfurt. "If they succeed, other nations will follow. We could lose half our mineral channels in Africa within a decade." The irony wasn't lost on those around the table. The more they spoke of maintaining control, the more they confirmed what the footage had already revealed. In the days that followed, the gold tunnel transformed into more than a crime scene. It became a pilgrimage site. Students came to photograph its golden walls. Activists left messages scrawled on scraps of paper, pleas for clean water, demands for education, vows to protect what remained of their land. Their voices echoed, layering onto the lingering sound of the hearing, turning the tunnel into something alive, impossible to forget. On a late-night broadcast, Leila closed her report with a sentence that seemed to capture the nation's mood. They thought the tunnel was theirs to empty. Instead, it has become the place where they are exposed. Far beyond Burkina Faso, in Europe's glass towers, that truth was beginning to cost them dearly. The revelation came not via intercepted foreign cable, but from a detailed slip in a local report. Buried in the data logs seized from the mining compound was a folder simply labeled "Monthly Forecasts." Inside were production estimates, satellite survey maps, and confidential environmental assessments, information only top Burkina Faso officials should have had access to. One file bore a timestamp just days before the arrest of the American executives. It had been emailed directly to a secure corporate account in New York from a government-issued address. Traoré stared at the sender's name, Minister Alain Tapsoba, Undersecretary for Natural Resources, a trusted figure who had stood beside him at press events, shaking his hand and declaring solidarity. The betrayal was as sharp as a blade. Tapsoba had been at every strategic meeting, aware of the timing of raids, the mapping of tunnels, the forensic audits of company accounts, and all while he was feeding information to the enemy. Traoré called for his intelligence chief. "Where is he now?" "At his home, Captain," came the reply. "Guards on the perimeter, but no sign he knows we've found the link." "Good," Traoré said. "He'll learn with the rest of the country." Just after sunrise, the streets of Agadir were already roused when the convoy rolled out. Traoré insisted on no secrecy, no quiet detention. This arrest would be public. The armored vehicle stopped outside a sprawling villa in one of the capital's wealthiest districts. High walls surrounded the property, but they couldn't contain the mounting murmur of onlookers crowding the gates. Alain Tapsoba emerged from the front door in a tailored suit, clearly expecting a diplomatic exchange, not the sight of soldiers approaching with cuffs. "Captain," he began, forcing a smile, "what is the meaning of this?" Traoré didn't return the smile. "The meaning is here," he said, producing a printed copy of the incriminating email. The crowd outside grew silent, sensing the shift. Tapsoba's eyes flicked between the paper and Traoré. "This is a misunderstanding," he offered. "No misunderstanding," Traoré replied evenly. "This is treason." A signal, and the cuffs clicked around Tapsoba's wrists. The metallic snap echoing across the walls and into the street. Phones shot up instantly, capturing every second as the former minister descended the marble steps and entered the waiting vehicle. By the time they reached Independence Square, word had already swept through the city. Crowds surged, some in angry shouts, others in stunned silence. "You sold us one man," someone called. "You fed them our gold in broad daylight." Traoré climbed onto the flatbed of a truck, the detained minister beside him. He lifted his voice. "The gold tunnel hearings taught our nation that foreign exploitation wasn't our only enemy. Now you see the rot within. This man stood as our protector, our resources, our future, yet he sold us out to those who robbed us." A wave of fury rolled through the crowd. Tapsoba tried to speak, but Traoré silenced him with a single, piercing look. "You betrayed not just your government," he continued, "but every child who will grow up with less because of your greed. Every farmer whose fields lie poisoned. Every family burying their dead, wondering why justice took so long. Today, they have their answer." Soldiers led Tapsoba away, his departure punctuated by the slamming of the van's doors. Leila stood in the front row, camera trained on Traoré's face. "You're making enemies in very high places," she said quietly. Traoré met her gaze. "High places are where the rot hides," he said. "If we strike only at the hands, the minds behind will simply find new hands." Back at the compound, the arrested Americans watched the footage of Tapsoba's arrest playing on state TV. For the first time, reality struck them. This was no longer just their conflict with Traoré. It was a purge with no refuge, even among insiders. In villages across the country, the arrest was spoken of quietly, but approval shone through. Elders remembered how corruption had once been untouchable, ministers growing rich behind closed doors while people starved. Now one of those doors had been torn open, in full view of all. That evening, Traoré returned to the gold tunnel alone, his fingers tracing the cold, gleaming wall. "Justice," he murmured to himself. "It must be complete, or it is nothing." The fight had never been just against outsiders. It was against every hand, foreign or domestic, that dared reach for what belonged to the people. And as the echo of Tapsoba's arrest rolled through the country, one truth became clear. There would be no safe harbor for betrayal. It began in a small village school near Kaya. A teacher named Ibrahim Traoré brought a stack of yellow construction paper to her classroom and told her students to cut out the shapes of gold bars. "Write on them," she said, "what you would build if this gold was ours." The children, most of them barefoot, hunched over their desks, carefully shaping their dreams in bright yellow. Some wrote hospital in shaky letters. Others drew wells, playgrounds, or libraries. One boy wrote only 3 words, "a roof here." The next morning, the children walked to the village square holding their paper gold bars high. Other schools saw the gesture and joined in. Within days, photos spread across the nation's social feeds. Children in dusty uniforms marching with yellow cards held like treasure. The idea caught fire. Soon, from towns and villages across the country, streams of children began walking toward Ouagadougou. They carried gold bars in their hands, backpacks slung under their arms. Some wore headbands made from strips of yellow paper. Others had written 4-hour schools in bold letters across their shirts. There were no shouted slogans at first, just the quiet shuffle of small feet on dirt roads. Parents walked alongside in silence, allowing the children's message to lead the way. By the time they reached the outskirts of the capital, there were thousands of them. The line stretched so far that from the air it looked like a river of yellow winding into the city. The police had been ordered not to interfere. Traoré, informed of their approach, left his meetings and went to meet them in person. He waited at the foot of Independence Square, his soldiers forming a respectful, protective perimeter. When the first children arrived, they stopped and looked up at him, unsure whether to speak. It was a girl of about 10 who broke the silence. Her name was Aissata Diallo, and she stepped forward clutching a gold bar made from folded cardboard. On it, she had written in careful script, "A hospital for my sister." She held it out to him without a word. Traoré knelt to take it, the gold cardboard stark against his dark uniform. "Tell me about her," he said softly. Hawa Diallo's eyes filled, but she did not cry. She was sick from the water. "Mama said," she whispered, "if there had been a hospital nearby, she might have stayed alive." Tria's jaw tightened as he stood, raising the cardboard bar high so all could see. "This is why we fight," he said, his voice carrying across the square. More children stepped forward, one after another, each handing him their paper gold. Some had drawn neat blueprints of schools with desks and chalkboards. Others had scrawled single words: water, books, food. An older boy, maybe 12, held up a bar on which he had drawn the gold tunnel. But instead of kneeling executives, he had drawn children at desks, smiling. "We don't need more tunnels," he told Traoré. "We need classrooms." The crowd began to chant then not the angry slogans of the Miners' March, but a simple, steady demand. Gold for schools, gold for hospitals. Their voices were high and clear, cutting through the afternoon heat like a hymn. News crews rushed to capture the scene. The footage would later show Traoré standing in the middle of a sea of children, their yellow paper bars raised to the sky. His expression a mix of resolve and something more personal, a quiet grief that such demands had to be made by the youngest among them. Leila moved among the children, her camera close to their faces, catching the unguarded moments. A little boy waving his gold bar like a flag. A shy girl slipping hers into Traoré's pocket when she couldn't reach his hand. A group of siblings holding a single large bar between them with the words, "One well for all," painted in bold red. Traoré turned to address them again. "The gold that was stolen will not be locked away," he promised. "It will not be sold to the same hands that took it. It will build what you are asking for: schools, hospitals, clean water. You will see it happen in your time, not in some distant future." The children responded not with cheers, but with something quieter, more powerful, a ripple of nods, as if they were making their own pact with him. The march did not disperse right away. Many of the children sat in the square, fanning themselves with their paper gold, sharing snacks their parents had packed carefully, proud of what their kids were doing. Some drew more bars to give to soldiers, who accepted them awkwardly, but with visible pride and humility. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the city bathed in golden light, Traoré stood at the balcony of the old government building overlooking the square. Below him, the children's yellow bars formed a mosaic on the ground. A patchwork of dreams laid out for all to see. It was no longer just a protest. It was a blueprint for the country's future, written by the hands that would live it. In that moment, he understood something that would stay with him. The fight for justice was no longer only about punishing the guilty. It was about earning the faith these children had just placed in him. It was a burden and a blessing both. The foundry floor roared with heat and purpose. Massive crucibles glowed, white-hot molten gold swirling inside like captured sunlight. Sparks leapt into the air as workers dressed in heavy protective gear moved with precision and focus. This was no ordinary refinery shift. This was history being forged, literally. Under armed guard, the gold seized from the illegal tunnels and recovered through the investigation was being melted down. The piles of raw, unmarked bullion, once hidden in offshore shipments or buried in secret vaults, were now being transformed into something new. Each bar, when cooled, would bear not the stamp of a foreign refinery, but the national seal of Burkina Faso. The crossed stallions and shield, sharp and proud against the gleaming surface. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood on a raised platform, wearing a simple, dark jacket rather than a military uniform. He had come not to supervise, but to speak. Cameras from national and international networks were positioned to broadcast every moment live. The world had seen the gold tunnel. They had seen the hearings, the arrests, the marches. Now they would see what came next. A foreman approached with the first completed bar, still steaming faintly in the cool air. Its weight was staggering, its surface perfect. Traoré took it in both hands, lifting it for the cameras. Outside the foundry gates, miners, villagers, students, and soldiers held their breath. He looked directly into the lens of the primary camera. "This," he said, his voice deep and steady, "is not for vaults. This is for building our future." He placed the bar onto a table beside him, where it gleamed under the bright lights. "For too long our gold has left this land without leaving anything behind. It has paved roads we will never walk, built schools our children will never attend, filled hospitals that will never treat our sick. That ends today." Isn't it powerful that stolen wealth can become a source of healing, not harm? Every ounce melted here will remain here, he continued, turned into the schools, hospitals, and wells our people deserve. A roar of approval rolled through the crowd outside. Inside the foundry, workers stood a little taller, each movement sharper, focused with pride. This wasn't just metal, it was their country's future being shaped by their own hands. Traoré gestured toward rows of cooling molds, each holding a bar stamped with the national seal. These bars won't collect dust in vaults, he said. They'll gather bricks for classrooms, beds for hospitals, pumps for clean water. They'll become something that lasts longer than gold. Dignity, opportunity, life. Leila stood among the camera crews, her lens capturing every emotion, the glint in his eyes, the firm set of his jaw as he spoke. She sensed this moment was more than a promise. It was a vow, not just to those who had suffered, but to the nation. Traoré continued, "Know this, you stole gold, but you couldn't steal our will. You couldn't steal our unity. Now the very gold you thought would enrich you will rebuild what you tried to break." He picked up another freshly stamped bar, warm to the touch, and held it out to the crowd. This belongs to every child who marched for schools, to every mother who demanded clean water, to every miner who risked his life for a fair wage. This is not mine. This is yours. The reaction was instantaneous. A deafening roar swept through the streets. Even the soldiers at the gates cracked smiles, their usual stoicism softened by the force of this moment. Traoré laid the bar gently back on the table and stepped aside, allowing cameras to capture the next bar being poured. Molten gold flowed like molten sunlight into each mold. Each stream another line in the story of rebirth they were writing together. Outside, a massive screen broadcast live to the thousands gathered. Families pointed proudly to the national seal on each bar as children waved their yellow paper bars in tribute to their real counterparts. Leila panned her camera from the workers to the crowd, knowing these images would travel far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Somewhere in the back, an old miner wiped tears from his eyes. "I never thought I'd see this," he murmured. "Our gold, our seal." As the broadcast reached its close, Traoré stepped forward once more. "When the world sees this gold, they will know it was not sold, not stolen, but claimed. And they will know that a nation that keeps its gold keeps its future." The crowd responded with a unified chant, swelling like a heartbeat. "Our gold, our future." In the foundry's heat, gold flowed. Each bar a promise cast in metal, and beyond the gates, beneath the wide African sky, the people felt, for the first time, that the ground beneath their feet was truly their own. The first black SUV rolled up just after sunrise, tinted windows concealing the occupants. Within minutes, more arrived, sleek diplomatic vehicles flying US embassy plates. They parked in a tight semicircle outside the military detention compound. Marines in crisp dress uniforms stood at attention, hands poised near sidearms, while the low hum of idling engines vibrated like a warning. Inside, the arrested Americans sat abreast in their cells, sensing a shift. Guards moved with sharpened purpose, rifles slung tightly as they watched the gate. Traoré was in his office when the radio crackled. "Sir, embassy convoy at the gate. They're requesting immediate access." He didn't need more. He rose, adjusted his jacket, and stepped out into the harsh morning light, the sun glinting off armored vehicles lining the perimeter. Forming swiftly, his soldiers blocked the entrance. A tall man in a dark suit descended from the lead SUV. It was the deputy chief of mission from the US Embassy, flanked by aides. His tone was polite, but firm. "Captain Traoré," he began, "I'm here on behalf of the United States government. We formally request the immediate release of those American citizens in your custody." Traoré stood unmoved. "They are not merely citizens," he replied evenly. "They are accused criminals in my country and will be judged under my laws." The diplomat smiled thinly. "With respect, this is a serious matter. Their detention risks becoming an international incident. Washington is prepared to resolve this if you are willing to cooperate." What does cooperation look like when the people are waiting for justice, not convenience? Traoré tasted that word bitterly. Is that what you call letting them go before facing the people they harmed? The diplomat's composure faltered slightly. Captain, there are channels, restitution, compensation. Traor's voice rose, clear enough for soldiers and the gathering crowd to hear. This is exactly how it's done when the law belongs to the people, not to foreign offices. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Phones appeared, capturing the standoff. Some held signs left over from the miners' march, no deals, no escape. The diplomat glanced at the cameras, unease replacing confidence. If you refuse to cooperate, I'm obligated to escalate this to sanctions, aid cuts, isolation. Traoré stepped forward until they stood almost nose to nose. The soldiers behind him stood firm, their grips on rifles tightened. You think I fear consequences? He asked quietly. The only consequences I fear are failing my people. Behind him, the gates loomed, locked. Inside, the detainees paced. Anxiety and something harder, hope, etched on their faces. They heard raised voices, but not the words. The diplomat tried again. If you keep them, you risk economic sanctions, aid cuts, isolation. We have been isolated before, Traoré replied sharply. And we survived. We will survive again. But what we will not do is hand over criminals to live comfortably while the children they harmed still drink from poisoned wells. The crowd erupted into cheers at his words. The embassy convoy drivers exchanged uneasy looks, and the diplomat's jaw tightened. Then you are making a grave mistake, he began. No, Traoré interjected, turning away. I'm making a promise. He faced the crowd, his voice rising so all could hear. These men will not be taken from this land until they have faced every witness, heard every testimony, and stood before the victims they wronged. They will not depart in black cars bound for quiet rooms. They will leave only when justice is done. The soldiers at the gate shifted, ready. The embassy vehicles remained motionless, tension humming through the air like a taut wire. Cameras clicked. The moment was already spreading online. After a long pause, the diplomat gave a curt nod to his aides. Very well, but know this is not over. Traoré did not look back. No, it isn't. The SUVs began to pull away one by one, engines fading into the distance. The soldiers relaxed just a fraction, but the crowd's energy intensified. They chanted Traoré's name, voices carrying into the compound. Inside, the executives settled back onto the hard benches in their cells. Their hopes, sparked by the sound of engines, proved premature. The gates had remained firmly shut, and now they understood. They would not leave until the people had spoken. The gold tunnel glowed under harsh white floodlights, its walls shimmering like silent witnesses to every injustice that had echoed through them. At the far end, a sturdy wooden table, humble in design but heavy with meaning, had been set up. Behind it sat the Council of Elders, men and women chosen from across Burkina Faso, each bearing the weight of decades serving their communities. No robes, no gavels. Their authority came instead from the unshakable trust of the people. The accused knelt at the center of the tunnel, wrists bound, suits rumpled and soiled by days in detention. They had listened to every testimony, every accusation, and the cameras were rolling again, broadcasting their solitary moment live across the nation. No one wanted this verdict hidden in private chambers. The people had a right to see it, to hear it, and to remember it. Traoré stood silently to the side, hands clasped behind his back as the elders conferred in hushed tones. Outside, the murmur of the crowd grew, a low thunder drumming through the earth. When the head elder, a tall woman named Fatoumata Keita, finally rose, the tunnel fell into a hush. Her eyes swept the kneeling men, and she began, "You came to our land as guests," her voice carrying the weight of gatherings beneath ancient baobab trees. "You promised work, roads, opportunity. Instead, you took our gold, poisoned our rivers, and left our people with nothing but empty hands and graves." She paused, letting those words echo through every stone and fissure. "We have heard the mothers who buried their children. We have heard the miners who risked their lives for mere scraps while you dined in luxury. We have seen villages that will never be whole again because of your greed." An executive opened his mouth, as if to protest, but the shifting bodies of hundreds pressed closer silenced him. Fatoumata Keita's voice sharpened. You will not leave this land. You will not return to comfort and forget what you have done. You will live out your days here in the prisons you deserve, working to repair what you have broken. You will breathe the same air as those you wronged, drink the same water, and know every day that you are here because the people willed it. Her gaze did not waver. The verdict of this council, by the voice of the people, is life imprisonment in Burkina Faso. Outside the tunnel, the crowd erupted. Justice! Justice! The chant surged through the air like a wave, its rhythm pounding against the stone walls until it seemed the tunnel itself was joining in. The camera crews turned their lenses to the faces of the condemned. Some were pale and trembling, their eyes darting as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. Others tried to mask their fear with defiance, but their tightened jaws betrayed them. The camera lingered on each of them in turn, holding their expressions for the nation to see. In the front row of the crowd, just inside the tunnel, Salamata Doumbia stood with her wooden staff, her eyes fixed on the men. She didn't smile, didn't cheer, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way her shoulders eased beside her. Nearby, Amadou Sissoko, the miner who had held up his brother's dented helmet, nodded slowly. They had not come for vengeance. They had come for truth to be recognized. And now it had been. Leila Cohn's camera captured a close-up of Fatoumata Keita as she delivered her final words. You thought gold was the most valuable thing in this land, she said. You were wrong. The most valuable thing is justice. And today, you have met it. Soldiers stepped forward to escort the prisoners out. The chains at their wrists clinked softly in the charged air. As they were led through the tunnel, the chants from outside grew louder, wrapping around them like a living verdict, one that would never fade. Traoré remained still until the last man had been taken out. Then he turned toward the elders, placing his hand over his heart in a gesture of respect. You have spoken for the people, he said. Fatoumata nodded. And now, Captain, you must keep the promise you made to them, that their gold will build the future. Outside, the sunlight was blinding after the gold-lit tunnel. The crowd pressed forward not to harm, but to see justice leave the tunnel in human form. The chant did not weaken, it grew stronger. A living drumbeat that followed the prisoners all the way to the transport vehicles. In homes across the country, families watched the broadcast in silence. Children leaned against their parents as the final shots of the condemned men filled the screen. When the image faded, the sound of the chant still seemed to hang in the air. Justice had been spoken in the gold tunnel, and it had answered. The council chamber was quiet, except for the soft shuffle of papers being placed before Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the gold seal of the Republic embossed on the top of the document. Around the long table sat ministers, community leaders, and representatives from the villages most scarred by the mining disaster. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if everyone knew this moment would echo long after today. On the table before him lay the reparations decree, an unprecedented order that would take every coin seized from the illegal mining network and pour it directly into the veins of the country's wounded communities. It was more than a policy. It was a promise in ink. Traoré scanned the final page, his eyes tracing the lines one last time. The profits, taken from our land, will now rebuild it, he said, his voice steady. Not tomorrow, not in a year, now. The decree spelled it out clearly. Funds from seized bank accounts, gold sales, and liquidated foreign assets would be directed in 3 urgent phases. First, rebuilding villages destroyed by toxic runoff, starting with permanent housing for those who had lost all. Second, cleaning and restoring poisoned rivers and wells, installing filtration in every affected community. Third, constructing schools, clinics, and vocational centers so the next generation would inherit opportunity instead of ruin. He looked up at the faces around the table. The survivors of the mining disaster will be the first to get new homes and medical care. They have waited long enough. At the far end, Salamata Doumbia sat with hands folded over her wooden staff. She had been brought from her village to witness this moment. Her voice was soft but resolute. Captain, promises have been made before. They were carried away on the wind. Traoré met her gaze. This one will be carved into the ground. You will see the houses rise, drink clean water again, and the gold they took will be the bricks and mortar of it all. He picked up the pen, its weight familiar, and signed his name in bold strokes. The sound of ink on paper was followed by the thud of his stamp pressing the seal into place. The room exhaled. Leila Cohn's camera caught the moment, zooming in on the ink, the seal, the steady hand committing the state to its people. She knew the image would be front-page news by nightfall, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the continent. The decree is law, Traoré announced, sliding the signed document to the clerks. Work begins today. Within hours, teams moved out. Military trucks loaded with supplies rolled toward the worst-hit villages. Surveyors marked sites for new homes. Engineers tested river water for restoration. Medical units set up mobile clinics for those suffering from years of contamination. In Salamata Doumbia's village, the first convoy arrived at midday. Children ran alongside the trucks, their laughter mixing with engine rumbles. Workers stepped down with shovels, bricks, and blueprints. One pointed to a hillside. The first houses will be here. Above the flood line, strong walls, real roofs. She touched her headscarf, not hiding tears. In the capital, the signing replayed on screens in markets, bus stations, and cafes. People stopped to watch, some skeptical, others cautiously hopeful. By evening, the mood had shifted. Radio hosts spoke of the decree as a turning point. Proof the Gold Tunnel case was about repair, not only punishment. At the Ministry of Health, teams drew up lists of survivors for priority care. Many had lived with untreated illnesses from mining toxins, skin lesions, respiratory problems, chronic pain. For them, the decree meant not only justice, but the chance to heal. In the following days, water trucks reached disaster zones, delivering clean drinking water while long-term filtration systems were built. For the first time in years, families could draw water without fear. Children filled buckets and splashed each other, their laughter echoing through places that had known only grief. In one village, a boy handed Traoré a cup from the new supply. "It doesn't smell," he said, grinning. "It tastes like rain." The captain took a sip, nodding. That's how it should have always been. Leila Cohn's reporting showed images of brick walls rising where there had once been only rubble, and classrooms taking shape beside fields being cleared for planting. She interviewed an elderly miner who had worked in the illegal tunnels under threat of violence. He stood beside a nearly finished home. "I thought I would die in the same ruin they left me in," he said slowly. "Now I will die under my own roof." In every village touched by the decree, there were scenes like this. Small, tangible changes that proved the gold was not vanishing into shadowed accounts or foreign hands. It was here, visible, solid, and growing for all to see. Back in the council chamber, Traoré reviewed the first progress reports. They were only days into the plan, but the signs were clear. "This is just the beginning," he told his ministers firmly. "When the people see that justice builds, not just punishes, they will guard it with their lives." Salamata Doumbia, visiting the capital to check on the decree's progress, stood beside him as he spoke. She didn't smile, but her voice carried the certainty of someone who had finally seen words become action. "We will hold you to that, Captain," she said quietly. "I expect you to," he replied, without hesitation. Outside, the streets buzzed with a rare energy. Not the fury of protest, nor the tension of confrontation, but the hum of a nation watching its stolen wealth return home, in bricks, mortar, and clean water. For the first time in years, justice was not just a word, it was something you could touch. It began in Bamako, where a crowd gathered outside the Parliament building, holding up signs painted with gold bars and the words, "Our land, our wealth." At first it was a few hundred voices, but within hours the crowd swelled into the thousands. They chanted not against a foreign power, but against their own leaders, demanding they follow the example set in Burkina Faso. "If Traoré can return the gold to his people, why can't you?" one young woman shouted into a megaphone, her voice carrying over the sea of bodies. News footage from Bamako ignited something across the continent. In Freetown, miners marched through the streets holding rocks and ore from their own soil, chanting for control over their diamond fields. In Kinshasa, students painted banners calling for an end to contracts signed in secret, their marches blocking the main boulevard. In Ara, fishermen rallied at the harbour, warning that their oceans were being sold off just as their gold had been. From Dar to Dar Salaam, the message was the same. Africa's resources must serve Africa first. In Nairobi, the protest began with university students spilling out of lecture halls. They carried images from the Gold Tunnel verdict. Traoré standing before the kneeling executives, the elders delivering judgment, the reparations decree being signed. The photos had gone viral, becoming symbols of a continent's quiet resentment turned loud. Justice is not charity, one student leader told the crowd. Justice is taking back what is ours and using it to build our future. Social media lit up with side-by-side comparisons. Gleaming towers in foreign capitals built on African wealth, and crumbling schools in the towns that produced it. Hashtags in Swahili, French, Arabic, and English carried the movement's pulse from city to city. Governments could not ignore it. In Lusaka, the president called an emergency meeting with his ministers after miners blocked access to a major copper facility, demanding all export contracts be made public. In Harare, Parliament faced an unexpected motion from opposition lawmakers to audit every foreign mining deal signed in the past 20 years. The fear in official circles was clear. If Burkina Faso's model spread, it would upend the comfortable arrangements that had kept wealth flowing outward for decades. Foreign investors began calling for stability, their coded word for keeping the old systems intact. But the ground was shifting. In Addis Ababa, African Union delegates found themselves surrounded by demonstrators as they entered the summit hall. Many protesters carried hand-painted replicas of Burkina Faso's seal stamped on gold bars. Their chant rang off marble walls, "One Africa, one wealth." Inside the summit, pressure was impossible to ignore. Delegates whispered about becoming the next target if their own resource deals were exposed. A few leaders, sensing the shift, spoke openly. "Our people will no longer watch their wealth leave in ships they never see," said one West African president. "We must reclaim control, or they will reclaim it for us." In Johannesburg, tens of thousands rallied outside the stock exchange. Former mine workers in worn uniforms stood beside young activists waving Pan-African flags. A speaker held up a photo of the Gold Tunnel. This is not just Burkina Faso's fight. It is Africa's fight against betrayal. The crowd roared. In Lagos, murals appeared overnight. One showed Traoré handing a gold bar with the seal to a child in uniform. Another depicted Africa as a great tree, roots wrapped around gold, diamonds and oil, pulling them back into the soil. Artists called it replanting the future. The movement faced pushback. In some capitals, riot police broke up protests and state media claimed foreign influence. The irony wasn't lost. Foreign control of resources was exactly the enemy. In Ouagadougou, Traoré addressed the wave during a national broadcast, speaking from the Gold Tunnel. "This is not only about Burkina Faso. The land beneath our feet is ours by right, not contract. When we keep what is ours, no one can call it theft." His words played in markets and bus stations. In Cotonou, a banana vendor watched on a passerby's phone. "He's speaking for all of us," she said. In Khartoum, a taxi driver told passengers, "If they can do it there, why not here?" Resource nationalism was now a movement, visible in streets, art, and speeches. Everywhere it spread, one name was invoked as proof, not savior: Traoré. The day the Gold Tunnel was sealed, Ouagadougou felt ceremonial. From morning, people arrived from every corner. Miners in faded overalls, mothers with photos of children, elders in traditional cloth, students with notebooks. They came to witness not an ending, but a beginning. Soldiers at the entrance stood as custodians, not guards. The gleaming archway was draped in the national flag. A white table held a book for visitors to sign, pledging to remember. Inside, the harsh lights were replaced by a soft golden glow, breathing warmth into the stone. Rows of bronze plaques lined the walls, each engraved with a scarred village and, beneath, the lives lost. Some plaques bore only a few names. Others were full from edge to edge. The effect was overwhelming. Visitors moved deeper into the tunnel, footsteps echoing softly. The gold in the walls no longer lured greed. It shone as witness to what was stolen and reclaimed. At the center, a circular chamber held an untouched block of unrefined gold on black stone, carved with, "For the people, for the land, for the future." Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood quietly, beret in hand, tracing names on plaques. At Salimata Doumbouya's village plaque, she stood beside him. "They will come here for years," she said. "Our grandchildren's children will know the cost." "And they will know we did not stay silent," he replied. Leila filmed faces. Solemn, tear-streaked, proud. A boy in uniform pressed his hand to a plaque as his father whispered its story. Outside, a children's choir sang, voices drifting into the tunnel. At its far end, a deep red steel gate bore the national seal. The Council of Elders, not the state, kept its key. Months later, the memorial became a pilgrimage site. Buses brought students, families, and traders who read plaques, stood before the gold, or left flowers, lamps, drawings, and prayers. Visitors came from across Africa, some pouring soil from their own mining towns at the entrance. Leaders walked it in silence, emerging deep in thought. Journalists called it a monument that honored the price of justice. The tunnel was never silent. Footsteps and whispers gave it a living presence. One day, Salimata Doumbouya returned with village children, showing them names they knew. "When people speak of the gold tunnel," she told them, "they will speak of you, your families, and what we won back." In that moment, under the soft light, the gold felt like a voice speaking of what was defended. The air was cool and still. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked slowly, fingertips brushing a plaque. Alone, he neared the entrance. Sunlight spilled inside like a river of fire. Stepping out, the glow merged behind and before him. A breeze lifted his jacket, carrying the sound of children's laughter. They were running toward him. Boys and girls in worn school uniforms, some barefoot, others in sandals worn thin from years of use, their faces lit with unfiltered joy. In their hands, they carried small gifts. Flowers gathered from roadside bushes, or the paper gold bars from the marches that had shaken the nation months earlier. One by one, they reached Captain Ibrahim Traoré, pressing their gifts into his hands, wrapping their arms briefly around his waist before darting back into the crowd. A little girl in a faded blue dress stepped forward on tiptoe to hand him a single red blossom. "For the schools," she whispered shyly. He smiled and tucked it gently into his pocket. Around them, the crowd was silent. Not from restraint, but from reverence. They had seen him in battle gear, at podiums in the glare of confrontation. Now they saw him unguarded, carrying flowers from the hands of children. Leila camera captured the moment in one sweeping frame, the sealed gold tunnel glowing in the midday sun behind him, the children surrounding him, and the vast African horizon stretching wide and open ahead. As he began walking toward the square, the children fell in step beside him, their laughter mingling with the rustle of flowers. In that moment, the weight of gold, the roar of crowds, and the strain of politics seemed distant. What remained was quieter, deeper, and unshakable. Later, the voice-over, born of this very moment, would close the broadcast. They thought gold was the prize, but the real treasure was dignity returned. As Traoré walked into the light, the flowers swaying with each step, the truth was written on every face beside him. That day, across Burkina Faso and beyond, Africa's story was no longer one of loss, but of reclamation. Streets that once echoed with anger now hummed with resolve. People spoke not of what had been stolen, but of what was being built. In Accra, Dakar, Nairobi, whispers became open calls. If it can happen there, it can happen here. This was more than the end of the gold tunnel. It was the opening of a new chapter for Africa, one where her wealth served her children, her rivers ran clean, and her dignity stood unshaken before the world. And now I ask, if your homeland's wealth had been taken for decades, would you forgive or fight to reclaim it? What do you believe is Africa's true gold? Her minerals or her people? If Traoré were your leader, would you trust him to change history? When a nation wins back what was stolen, should it use it to punish or to build? Share your thoughts below, and if you believe in a united Africa and leaders who stand for justice, leave 2 simple words in the comments. One Africa. If you believe in Africa, in Traoré, and in the power of dignity reclaimed, please like, share, and subscribe. Watch the next video as we explore more true stories rewriting Africa's future. Thank you for being part of this journey. And until we meet again, may the gold of our nations always shine for our people.